Howdy again everyone, my name's Chris and today I have a brand new lens from Chinese manufacturer Viltrox for you all, their AF 24mm f1.8 Z. Well actually it's not brand new, it's been around for Sony E-mount cameras for a little while now, but I wanted to test out this Nikon Z mount version of it as I was really curious how it would perform as a third-party autofocus lens on Nikon's new system. In that way it's really quite a rarity. It's a full-frame lens that costs $430 in the US or about £350 in the UK. I'd like to say a big thank you to Viltrox for providing this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review and I love testing 24mm lenses with bright apertures. On a full-frame camera their images are just so dramatic and potentially useful for all sorts of applications. First off though, let's take a look at the build quality, and anyone who's handled a Viltrox lens before will be very familiar with how it feels and works. The lens barrel is solid and metallic, feeling pretty tough, with a nice brushed finish to it. The lens mount is also made of metal, as you can see, and although there's no weather sealing gasket here, there is a USB-C port for future firmware updates, and Viltrox have a good reputation for keeping their lenses updated nicely. Next, there comes a metallic aperture ring, which turns around without clicks, except to get into auto mode. It turns with just enough resistance to stop you accidentally changing aperture. I'd prefer a mechanism with clicks myself, really, although the smooth aperture change works very nicely when shooting video, which is important for some users. The autofocus motor works silently and at a pretty quick speed, and there were no accuracy issues with it either, so that's great news. Another good point for video makers is that the lens doesn't really display much focus breathing, as you can see here, just a bit of warping in the corners of the image. The lens's filter size is a fairly small 55mm and it comes with a little plastic hood, and it does not have image stabilization. Overall, in terms of build quality, it's a nice little package, small and tough. It works perfectly well and could be especially useful for video work. Now let's take a look at image quality. I'll be testing it on my 45MP Nikon Z7 with its full frame sensor. In the middle of the image, straight from f1.8, we see excellent sharpness and contrast, although there is just a tiny bit of visible purple fringing here. Let's take a look into the corners. They are definitely hazier and a bit dark, but we are still seeing some detail being captured and nothing much in the way of colour fringing. Let's top down to f2.8. There's a big improvement there now. Sharpness looks great. In fact, those corners actually look sharper than the Sony version of the lens I tested a while ago. The lens stays this sharp down to f8. At f11 or darker, we do begin to see a little softness emerging due to vignetting. Overall, for a low-budget, full-frame lens with such a bright aperture, it's a very nice performance indeed. Things are a little hazy and murky and dark in the corners at the brightest apertures, but there's always some good detail being captured, and the lens is excellent when it's topped down a little bit. Now let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting. I wanted to see how well Viltrox had got Nikon's in-camera corrections to work here. So on the left, you can see pictures taken without automatic corrections, and on the right, those taken with in-camera corrections turned on. The eagle-eyed among you might notice from the sharpness section that the Viltrox lens runs into some pretty serious problems with distortion here. If you don't correct your images, then you're treated to a very wavy distortion pattern, and at f1.8, extremely dark corners. If you use in-camera corrections, then that vignetting is reduced but still quite strong, and the distortion is pushed into the corners where we see a pincushion pattern emerging, and the whole image is zoomed in just slightly with corrections turned on as well. Even if you stop down as far as f4, you still see some vignetting, even on a corrected image, so it is clear we've stumbled across this lens's Achilles heel here. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. The lens can focus down to about 30cm, not especially close to your subject. The good news though is that close-up image quality remains pretty sharp, even at f1.8, and if you top down to f2.8, you get a little increase in contrast. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. On the Sony version of the lens, there were serious problems, but Viltrox seem to have made some kind of improvements, and flaring and glaring aren't really such a major problem now, unless the bright light is right on the edge of the frame, so using your lens hood will help here. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at chroma levels. At f1.8, bright lights in the corner of your images show noticeable smearing here. At f2.8, that smearing is greatly reduced, and at f4, it's basically gone. Let's zoom out a bit and look for some sun stars. They are just barely visible at f4, as you can see, but if you stop down all the way to f8 or f11, then they become pretty impressive if the point of light is bright enough. Finally, let's take a look at this lens's bokeh. 24mm is a pretty wide angle, but at f1.8 you can still separate your background quite noticeably, especially if you get close to your subject. Generally, the lens performs well when it comes to the quality of those backgrounds. They look pretty soft to me in most situations. If backgrounds are just slightly out of focus, then they can look a little busy in the transitional zones, but deeply out of focus areas look lovely. Overall, I'm glad I tested this Nikon version of the Viltrox lens. It does seem to be a slight optical improvement over the Sony version, being just a little sharper with better contrast. It still suffers from some pretty jaw-dropping vignetting and distortion, but at this price point you simply can't have it all. It could be particularly useful for video work too, if you're happy to correct your footage a little. Its build quality is also very nice and its price quite reasonable, and so it certainly comes recommended. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review. I love putting them together. They can be time consuming and a little bit costly though, so if you'd like to support this channel and you found the videos helpful, take a look over on my Patreon page. There you can find all kinds of exclusive content for supporters of this channel, and it makes a big difference. Ciao for now.